Our lecture tonight is with Professor Michael Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz is Professor of Sociology at the State University of New York at Stony Brook and has written extensively on popular protest and insurgency, U.S. business and government dynamics, and imperialism in the Middle East. His work has appeared in the Asia Times, Mother Jones, Tom Dispatch, ZNet, Against the Current, Context, the International Socialist Review, Socialist Worker, and Z Magazine, amongst others. He's the author of several books, including most recently War Without End, The Iraq War in Context, which is published by Haymarket Books in 2008. And there are a handful of copies at the table there, which folks should pick up. And in a particularly distinct honor, the McCarthyite right-winger David Horowitz named him one of the 101 most dangerous academics in the United States. I just found that today, otherwise it would have been in all the publicity. So without further ado, Dr. Schwartz, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me. As you may know, I've been more or less obsessed with the various American imperial wars for the last few years, and have been thinking about them in a lot of different contexts. And today what I'd like to do is to focus on the bigger picture, as big a picture as I can get about U.S. foreign policy, and in particular in the Middle East, and try to describe the method in the madness, let's call it that, you know, I think a lot of the time, especially those of us who are really against these wars, are very impressed with how lunatic American policy looks. And how counterproductive it is. And it is counterproductive even from the point of view of the leaders who have enunciated and enacted it. But I think that there is a method there, and there's a goal there, and there's an ambition there, and there's a pattern there that we need to keep our eyes on, both just from the point of view of understanding what in the world is going on, but also from the point of view of understanding it well enough to do something to change it, stop it, reverse it. And so I want to pick on, and maybe this is, you know, beating up a little when they're down, considering that, I guess, as of the news today, McChrystal is gone, right? Is that right? I've heard this. And Petraeus has been kind of subtly demoted. He used to be running CENTCOM, the whole command, and now he's going to be running the war in Afghanistan. He's going to be his own subordinate, I guess. You know, and I guess that'll solve some problems. At least he won't be criticizing his superior. But maybe he'll still do that when he's drunk. Who knows? But a year ago, a little more than a year ago, Petraeus actually was the first of the Obama administration officials to enunciate a kind of general statement about what the U.S. policy was going to be in the Middle East. As the ascending commander at that point of CENTCOM, the command that covers what used to be called the Arc of Instability, right, all the way from the border of China, all the way through the Horn of Africa, right, he was required to come and explain to Congress exactly what he had in mind and how he was going to proceed as this new commander. And this speech is really boring. Right, it's just filled with hackneyed, familiar phrases that didn't sound any different from what we've been hearing for years. But I think, in a way, it's that very lack of originality that really contains a lot of the content. Because if we look at it closely, we see that he's really enunciating what the policy for the new Obama administration is going to be in the Middle East, and how it all fits together. So I want to go through it, to start and go through it, and see if we can get a picture of what U.S. policy in the Middle East is from this, with augmented with a few other things. Okay, so now Petraeus began his presentation by describing his area of responsibility, or in military jargon, his AOR, right? Officially known as the United States Central Command, or, in military jargon, CENTCOM, which is the phrase we hear all the time, right? Here's his introductory paragraph describing his command. The lands and waters of the CENTCOM AOR span several critical and distinct regions, stretching across more than 4.6 million square miles in 20 countries. The AOR contains vital transportation and trade routes, including the Red Sea, the North Indian Ocean, and the Arabian Gulf, as well as strategic maritime choke points at the Suez Canal, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Strait of Hormuz. The CENTCOM AOR encompasses the world's most energy-rich region. This is the introduction. Most energy-rich region, with the Arabian Gulf region and Central Asia together, accounting for at least 64% of the world's petroleum reserves, 34% of its crude oil production, and 46% of its natural gas reserves. Right, this is him introducing his AOR. Right. And now, you could be surprised in this introductory paragraph that he didn't choose to describe his area of responsibility in terms of the military challenges that it presented. Right? He did not choose to introduce this region as an epicenter of violent conflict in the last 50 years, and for many years, the arc of instability, the label given by U.S. government officials when the Bush administration took office in the year 2000. Nor did he choose to introduce it as the focal point of the war on terror that the Bush administration initiated, and he did not choose to describe it as the prime source of safe havens from which Islamic extremists could launch attacks on the U.S. and its allies, right? I think we get from this a really powerful sense of the way in which the military, then remember, he's the military commander sees the role of the U.S. military, right? The U.S. military's job is to police this very important area. He chose to introduce it in terms of its economic and commercial role in what we now call a globalized world. The big emphasis in Petraeus' characterization was the region's mineral wealth, the world's most energy-rich region, and its commercial importance, vital transportation and trade routes, including strategic maritime choke points. Now, a more vivid expression of this marriage of military and economic concerns was contained in the June 2010 revelation about Afghanistan, right, which maybe many of you saw, because it was actually one of the few investigative journalist reports that the New York Times has generated in the last little while, right? Front page, top left-hand corner. What did we find out? That there was $1 trillion in accessible mineral wealth in Afghanistan. And one of the really interesting things about this is that this discovery, they kind of knew it in 1980, right? The official discovery of it was several years ago. Right? They actually did surveys. They went out. The scientists came back. They said, we've got the steel over, we've got the iron ore over here, and we've got the coal over there, and we got that great lithium that is going to do all sorts of great things for everybody. And why did it come out right now? So the media asked that question over and over again. And what was the answer that they came up with? Well, it was basically that this is being released right now because the support for the war in Afghanistan is waning in the United States and in the European countries that constitute NATO, right? This is BBC analyst Jill McGiverney put it. She says, at a time of growing despair about Afghanistan and its government, the portrayal of the country as a potential gold mine could help to bolster international resolve and paint the country as, this is a great phrase, a prize worth fighting for. Right? This is the reporter's summary of what she had heard from the various military officials. And it was very interesting because in the reporting in the Times and in the subsequent reporting in the other media, there was much more quotation from military officials than anyone else, right? It's all right. This whole juxtaposition of the economic and the military, this folding together, this intermingling of the two things, is really a critical element in understanding U.S. foreign policy, U.S. military policy, and these wars, right? In his presentation, Petraeus did eventually mention the more traditional military targets that one might have expected to be the centerpiece of his description, right? But even in this context, he reiterated this military marriage to political economy. For example, He has a brief section in this testimony called Most Significant Threats to U.S. Interests, right? And here's how he introduces this. The most serious threats to the United States, its allies, and its interests in the CENTCOM AOR lie in the nexus of transnational extremists, hostile states, and weapons of mass destruction. The nexus of these three things, right? Now we're getting onto familiar territory, right? This is what we always hear about, right? This is what he says. Across the AOR, Al-Qaeda and its extremist allies are fueling insurgency to, what do we expect here? We expect to set up safe havens so they can attack the neighbors, set up safe havens. Are fueling insurgency to reduce U.S. influence and to destabilize the existing political, social, and economic order. The existing political, social, and economic order, right? There's no mistaking here, right, that economic order is this global economic order that the United States is instructing its military to protect, right? Now, in the entire 10,000-word presentation to Congress, he never mentioned the threat of attacks against the United States. He just didn't mention it. Now, if you got him afterwards and said, why didn't you mention that? He says, I forgot, right? I mean, you're not going to say there is no threat, right? You're not going to say there is no threat, right? But it's not there. It's not even mentioned because he's really got his eye on the ball here. He understands that what he is talking about is that he is in charge of an American expeditionary force in the traditional colonial tradition, right, of going to that region and pacifying that region, right? Okay? Now, he didn't dwell only on these kinds of defensive measures, defending the realm, defending, stabilizing regimes, right? Maintaining U.S. influence, right? These are kind of defensive things. There's a very expansive vision contained in here, which I think we'll also hear an echo from, right? And it involved an ambition which may sound a little different from what we normally hear, but if you recall earlier iterations of this policy, or later ones too, it's there. It's the idea of integrating the countries in the Middle East into what he calls in this speech a network of cooperation. He's trying to distinguish it from a traditional kind of alliance, right, or something looser, right? Utilizing, and this is how he puts it, a whole-of-government approach, that's our government that he's talking about, a whole-of-government approach that fully integrates our military and non-military efforts, right, and those of our allies and partners, right? So he sees himself as part of this very large machine, Now, for those of us who have kind of followed the war, along, this is not inconsistent with something that was very sort of prevalent in the news for a while, is how the military had become more and more and more prominent, and the military was put in charge of reconstruction of Iraq, right? This idea that the military, Rumsfeld's military was very aggressive in trying to grab as much authority and as much responsibility as it could get, including, eroding the State Department. The State Department becomes an appendage of the military. But if you look at this from a prism just one step beyond that, it's not so much, who's going to get to dominate within this, but this idea of the integration of this whole-of-government approach, right, is a very powerful image, and it's very instructive to us to understand what in the world is going on out there. And here's how he summarizes what he wants to see happen in his area of responsibility. A model characterized by a focus on common interests, inclusivity, and capacity building can best advance security and stability in the region. This network of cooperation is both effective and sustainable because it creates synergies, and as it grows, notice he's got a long-term prospect here. As it grows, strengthens relationships. Each cooperative endeavor is a link connecting countries in the region, and each adds to the collective strength of the network. The mechanisms put in place to coordinate efforts in one area, such as piracy, smuggling, or littoral security, can often be leveraged to generate action in other areas, such as, listen to this, a rapid response to major oil spill in the Gulf. Boy, that was prescient. Right? Wrong Gulf. He's talking about the wrong Gulf, right? And notice that we really have not done our network work here because we don't have a very good whole-of-government approach to that particular oil spill, right? Such as rapid response to a major oil spill in the Gulf or the aftermath of a typhoon or an earthquake. He didn't say hurricane, right? Moreover, progress made in generating cooperation on a set of issues can serve as opening for engagement on other issues, thereby promoting greater interdependence. As a result, a growing network not only works to improve interoperability and overall effectiveness in providing security, it also builds trust and confidence among neighbors and partners, right? And let's be clear that this word partner has a very precise meaning here. It means the countries that the United States considers to be its partners, and it is their partner also. So what we have is this picture of this regionally contiguous group of countries, right, all working together with the key node in the network being a country that is 7,000 or 8,000 miles distant, right, but not really, because, of course, the military is going to be there and a lot of other things. So this is the picture. This is what the military is supposed to be doing, right? This is the military supposed to be building all this, right? Oh, but it's a whole-of-government approach, so they're going to get help from the State Department and everybody else, right? This network of cooperation imagery assumes the United States as a central actor in the region. His promise of a rapid response to a major oil spill or a typhoon or earthquake assumes activities far from narrow military concerns. And his expectation that a set of issues can serve as an opening for engagement on other issues assumes an enduring U.S. presence in the region. Right? So all this talk about, we hear a lot of talk about withdrawing the military from Iraq, but not from the region. Let's be clear on that, right? And we're not really, right, saying withdrawing from Iraq, even if the military goes away. Because what's going to happen, right, in the image of Petraeus as we reduce the military in Iraq? What's going to happen, right? Well, this regional philosophy has to be enacted, right? And as we withdraw, right, what are we going to look for, right, to go on? Right? And I want to come back to that in a second because there's a very interesting piece of reporting in the last few days, right? But I want to just add one more piece to this big picture, right, which is not from the Petraeus, presentation, but rather from the document that is considered to be the Bible for security. Every 4 years, quadrennially, right, the United States issues a national security strategy. There was one in 2002. That was the first Bush one, right? That's the one that enunciated the philosophy of preemptive war, right? There was a 2006 one, and we've just had a 2010 one, the first Obama one, right? In the 2006 document, the Bush administration enunciated the following 9 essential tasks assigned to the U.S. military, right? Here they are. Champion aspirations for human dignity. Sounds good. Strengthen alliances to defeat global terrorism and work to prevent attacks against us and our friends. You see, now in Petraeus, we didn't even hear that, but you can see that, his thing certainly encompasses that. Here's number 3. Work with others to defuse regional conflicts. Most of us would say, gee, aren't you creating regional conflicts? But let's leave that aside. This is the ambition. 4, prevent our enemies from threatening us, our allies, and our friends with weapons of mass destruction. 5, ignite a new era of global economic growth through free markets and free trade. 6, this is the security policy, folks. 6, expand the circle of development by opening societies and building the infrastructure of democracy. I think we all hear building the infrastructure of democracy there. But I think what we should hear in that phrase is by opening societies. That opening societies is one of the themes that I think we have heard so many times over the time, and most of us never pause to ask ourselves, what is that? Right? What is that? 7, develop agendas for cooperative action with other main centers of global power. 8, transform America's security institutions to meet the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. And 9, engage the opportunities and confront the challenges of globalization. Okay? Now, this is the National Security document of 2006. And I think you can hear pretty clearly, right, that there's 3 military essential tasks. And there's 6 other essential tasks, humanitarian, political, and economic ambitions in the other 6, right? Particularly noteworthy for me was the emphasis on opening Middle East societies to the circle of development and thus igniting a new era of global economic growth through free markets and free trade. If you take that and you put it next to Petraeus, what you get is a pretty good picture that what the U.S. goal is going to be in this period, right, is to transform these societies, to get in there and change them from top to bottom, open them up. Economics, free trade, none of this crazy pseudo-socialism that they've got, these governments that we don't like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're going, this is transformation time, folks. It's transformation time. Right? And the military is the cutting edge for this. That's the conception that you get out of these documents, right? And even when they talk about extending liberty and prosperity, right, which is right down below as they begin to describe this in this 2006 document, the 3 elements in extending liberty and prosperity are opening markets and integrating developing countries into the world's global system, opening, integrating, and diversifying energy markets to ensure energy independence. There's a very interesting phrase there. Opening these energy markets in the Middle East to ensure our energy independence, right? Why will that ensure our energy independence? We'll open their markets to ensure our energy independence, right? Unpacking that, it means that we won't be dependent on people like Saddam Hussein or the mullahs in Iran, right? We got to get rid of those kinds of governments, set up governments that are open, right? And in practice, what that means, right? In practice, in their vision, is we got to get the control of that oil out of the hands of those governments and put it in the hands of, fill in this sentence, right? Multinational oil corporations, right? And it's no accident that when the United States invaded Iraq, toppled Saddam Hussein, right? 1 month later, they promulgated a new oil law for Iraq that said what we're going to do is we're going to take the oil in Iraq and we're going to lease it out to the international oil companies, right? And we're unable to enact that, right? Because an insurgency intervened. But that was the original policy, and they're still pressing for it, right? So, and then finally, reforming the international financial system to ensure stability and growth. So, this idea of liberty and prosperity is these are the 3 centerpieces of it, right? They're all right at the structure of the political economy. Boom, 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 right? And we seek, and here's the picture from the 2006 document. We seek a Middle East of independent states at peace with each other and fully participating in an open global market of goods, services, and ideas. The familiar idea of opening markets, omnipresent in foreign policy rhetoric for 3 decades, contains the assumption of economic transformation, especially when applied to the Middle East, where accomplishing such an opening would require, and does require, a profound and fundamental change in the way these countries conduct their economic, social, and political life. Now, in the body of Petraeus' presentation, he has thumbnail sketches of the various countries. I just want to mention Afghanistan and Iraq as a way of looking more concretely at what this big policy looks like. His comments on Afghanistan lent substance to his more general concerns. He assured Congress that the military campaigns there would be, quote, integrated into the broader plan to promote political and economic development, right? The military campaigns will be integrated into the broader plan. The big plan is political and economic development. The military campaigns are a narrow piece of it, right? As a prime example of this, how we would apply this broader plan, Petraeus pledged to develop a new agricultural regime to replace opium, okay? In case you haven't been following the news, opium is the country's largest cash crop. In 2009, it accounted for over 50% of the gross domestic product of Iraq, of Afghanistan, sorry. Okay, here's his description of this goal, of what he's going to do. Another major component of our strategy is to disrupt narcotics trafficking, which has provided significant funding to the Taliban insurgency. This drug money has been the oxygen in the air that allows these groups to operate. Right? They didn't have it in Iraq, but they managed to operate anyway. It's interesting. This drug money has been the oxygen in the air that allows these groups to operate. With recent extension of authority granted to U.S. forces to conduct counter-narcotics operation, we are better able to work with the Afghan government more closely to eradicate illicit crops, shut down drug labs, and disrupt trafficking networks. So they're in there going to wipe out this piece of the Iraqi economy, this illicit piece of the Iraqi economy. To complement these efforts, we will also promote viable agricultural alternatives. Got to give them something, right? Build Afghan law enforcement capacity and develop the infrastructure to help Afghan farmers get their products to market. Okay. Now, program streams seem straightforward and familiar. It's, it's part of our popular understanding. The destruction of opium cultivation is an essential part of the military campaign, right? I mean, you hear the way it's presented, right? It's not presented as, though in other contexts you hear this, right? We got to get rid of the opium trade. It's a terrible thing, blah, 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 blah. They do say that. That's not what they don't say. But what he chooses to emphasize here is that it's a military target, right? We have to get rid of the opium trade because the Taliban is using the opium in order to finance the insurgency, and we want to defeat the insurgency, so defeat the opium, right? That's the way he's presenting it here, and it's not inaccurate to their thinking, right? I'm not questioning the logic of this at all, right? But, of course, in the process of doing that, he also is destroying a large part of this poor, impoverished, and what we now call a narco state, right? We even have a name for it, right? It's become a country that's dependent on narcotics trade. Colombia, the amount of the Colombian economy that is involved with the narcotics trade is minuscule compared to Afghanistan, right? They really are kind of enslaved economically to it at this point, right? So you're going to destroy their economy as part of the military campaign, right? That's part of what he's saying here. And he's saying, okay, we're going to fix that. We're going to rebuild that agricultural economy on other terms, right? We're going to get, rather than illicit, we'll have licit, legal crops like wheat, right? And we're going in there and we're building. And listen to this imagery, right? The military would, this is his words, take a residential approach and in a culturally acceptable way, live among the people, understand their neighborhoods, and invest in relationships. So we're going in and we're going to build a new Afghan society, wholly transformed, open to the rest of the world, part of the world market, fully globalized, integrated, and we're going to do it right from the bottom up, right? Now, part of what we laugh at about this is the idea that our military could do this, right? And a lot of the soldiers laugh at it too. They say, I'm a soldier. Come on. I can kill people. That's what I know how to do, right? What are you talking about here, right? But then other soldiers have bought into this. There's a whole philosophical background to this called counterinsurgency, right? Which is, in fact, it's a military philosophy that had a lot of, had a lot of traction in American military during the Vietnam War until it self-destroyed itself there, right? And that's a whole other story. The whole question of counterinsurgency as a military philosophy is an important thing to consider because after a hiatus of about 30 years, if you remember, for example, the Powell Doctrine from 1991, right, that's like a complete opposite of counterinsurgency, right? That's sort of make sure that you have overwhelming force and go in and slaughter everybody, right? This is, no, we're going to, embed ourselves in the, we're going to embed ourselves in the communities, right? And we laugh at it because we just don't think it can be done. But the image, remember, is a whole-of-government approach. This is a whole-of-government approach. It's not only supposed to be the military. Eventually, in Iraq, especially now, and Afghanistan, as soon as we get it all together, there's supposed to be a huge civilian component to this. And I don't think we laugh as much at that idea of imagining, a huge horde of American experts or American-hired experts or contractors or anthropologists and psychologists and sociologists who were all being recruited for this effort, by the way, right? Going into these communities and figuring out how to deliver what, in one iteration of this, they call a government in a box. You've probably heard that phrase, a government in a box. You sort of set up the government. You've got all the people, you've got the accountants, and you've got the administrators, and you've got the agricultural experts, and you've got the mayor, and you've got them, and you'd show up in a community, and you sort of give them a whole government, right? It doesn't emerge out of the community. It's broad, right? That's part of it, right? At the same time that you're teaching them this new agriculture, and you're going to build a road so they can get the product to the market, and the whole thing's going to be done, right? And we're going to revolutionize this society, right? Okay? Now, here's what Petraeus said about Iraq. He says, though the trends in Iraq have been largely positive, progress has been uneven, and the situation still remains fragile and reversible. It's another one of these very familiar phrases we've heard, right? A return to violence remains an option for those who have set aside their arms. He's got the picture of, a lot of the insurgents have put their arms aside, but they can always go back to it. Enemy organizations, especially al-Qaeda in Iraq and Iranian-backed Shia extremist groups, right, remain committed to the narrow sectarian agendas and the expulsion of U.S. influence from Iraq. Not expulsion of U.S. from Iraq, expulsion of U.S. influence from Iraq, right? So if you go back to that imagery of partners and this kind of thing, you see what his vision is, right? His vision is that the U.S. should have a profound influence, right? Okay? The fragility in Iraq, then, lay in the possibility that the enemy organizations would accomplish the expulsion of U.S. influence. Petraeus, then, the military, took on as its goal, even while it's withdrawing its troops, the preservation of U.S. influence in the country, consolidating the partnership relations, as well as Iraq's integration into the network of cooperation that was the ultimate goal for the region, right? Now, this same imagery has been picked up over and over again since this is a year ago now that speech was given. And I'll just briefly give you a sense of how the national security strategy that Obama issued just last month, actually. I mean, it was issued in May, but I don't think it ever became public until June. So people are still digesting it, right? But if you go through it and you look at it, and by the way, the language is very different. If you're looking for differences between Obama Bush, certainly in this national security strategy, the language is very different. It's much more Obama-esque language. But the imagery isn't different, right? Not from the Petraeus speech, not from the 2006 document. Here's what they said about goals. It promised to, this is a quote, pursue comprehensive engagement across the region. You know, this idea of, they don't say disengagement. They say withdraw troops. They don't say disengagement, right? Comprehensive engagement across the region. And for Iraq in particular, to, quote, cultivate an enduring relationship, build new ties of trade and commerce between Iraq and the world. That's opening up Iraq, right? And, quote, retain a robust civilian presence commensurate with, this is U.S. civilian presence, commensurate with our strategic interests in the country and the region, right? Remember those strategic interests? The energy, the choke points, the trade. That's Obama. That's Obama's security plan. This isn't Obama's political plan. It's a security plan, right? It's the same vision, right? So what do we find out? Well, the State Department is planning for this civilian presence, right? And just in the paper the other day, now we're talking about, right, you may have heard this before, the United States invested just under $1 billion in Iraq to build an embassy, right? Just under $1 billion. It is the largest embassy in the history of the world, okay? No one's ever done this. It was designed for 1,000 what they called diplomats, but that means administrators, right? There are currently 1,800 of them, right? They need more room, okay? In 1900, Britain, the colonial power in India and Pakistan, which at that time was a single realm, right, had less than 1,000 administrators to rule an area that had 300 million people in it. Iraq has 27 million people in it, and we've got 1,800. So that picture of down on the ground, right, all over the place is not trivial, right? They're serious about it. They not only have the 1,800 employees, they have 13,000 contractors right now, okay? And what did the State Department say in an AP release just the other day? The State Department says its diplomatic staff won't be safe after the American military leaves unless it has its own combat-ready protection force. They need their own army. A warning that underscores concerns about the Iraq army and police the U.S. has spent billions of dollars training and equipping. Vehicles and aircraft used by the departments, this is what they call it. Their army is going to be called the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, to protect personnel in other parts of the world. The kind of things that they have already are, quote, inadequate to the extreme security challenges in Iraq. According to documents the State Department sent to the Pentagon in April, the Bureau will need, quote, to duplicate the capabilities of the U.S. military by December 2011, when the military is due to be gone. The State Department wants 24 of the Army's Black Hawk helicopters, 50 bomb-resistant vehicles, heavy cargo trucks, fuel trailers, high-tech surveillance systems, et cetera, right? So if indeed the military does withdraw from Iraq, it is not a U.S. withdrawal, right? It is it's a change in the nature of the U.S. presence, I would grant, even if these guys get their little army. That'll be a small army compared to what we have there now. But that overarching goal, right, of the U.S. to have a persuasive influence, right, is unremitting, and it continues to right now. This is from last week, okay? Now, here's the problem, okay? So this is what the United States has been doing and will continue to do, right? And one of the things that are really dangerous for us not to keep track of both the fact, right, that these big military operations do dramatically terrible things in these countries, but also that there are going to be equally dramatic and powerful efforts to transform these countries, right? The effort at transformation is just as significant a thing as these destructive elements of the military. And in fact, the two are dovetailed, right? They're dovetailed in the way that this narcotics offensive in Afghanistan are operating, right? The military is very destructive in terms of the economy. But in the context of transforming Iraq, that destructiveness is not so bad, right? In fact, it can be absolutely positive because you're wiping out the old system and now we're going to put in the new system, right? That's not so bad. So, for example, right, during the offensives, right, during the offensives in Iraq, right, one of the things when there would be an insurgent stronghold is the United States would bomb the electrical power plant, right, because that would really deprive the insurgents of their ability to continue fighting, right, because they're using electricity in all sorts of ways, right. So just bomb it. Well, that's not so bad because that was an outmoded, terrible plant, and we're going to, be coming in here and really modernize the whole electrical grid for the country. So we can go ahead and knock that out. By the way, they knocked out a few hospitals by the same logic, right? But that was okay too because the U.S. plan, Iraq. This is a tragic thing to say, In 1980, Iraq had the best medical system in the Middle East. It started to go downhill then because the Saddam Hussein regime eroded the quality of it. But I'm going to take another 10 minutes here. They eroded the quality of it, but it was still, a pretty damn good system, just deprived of resources in 2003 when the United States invaded. But the U.S. doesn't like that system. That system was a state-owned, state-run, public health, single-payer, single-employer system, right? We're against anything single, we don't like, right? So the U.S. came in and said, well, we're going to transform your system. And they did. They said, well, first of all, we're going to starve the hospitals for resources. So it was a hospital-based system. We're going to have a primary care system that we're going to build. They gave a contract to Bechtel to build 120 primary care facilities, right? In the end, after $350 million, right, 20 of them were completed, right? And Bechtel walked away and said, we'll take the $300 million and we'll go. We'll take our $300 million and go home, right? They don't have that. There was this, you might have even seen it, Laura Bush said she was going to build this great children's hospital in Basra. It was never completed, right? Never completed. There's a hospital that was built and handed over to the Iraqis with no equipment, and there was no technicians who had been trained to work the new fangled equipment that were brought in there. Right? And these stories are multiplied over and over and over again. I'll just tell one electrical story. And so after they bombed a lot of these electrical plants, right, and by the way, there's the other aspect to the bombing thing is that when you bomb in cities, you bomb the sewage system. So now 94% of all the sewage in Iraq is going into the rivers, right, because the sewage system has been annihilated and it hasn't been rebuilt. Now they were going to rebuild the electrical system, but they didn't, right? One of the really big contracts installed 15 brand new generators. They ripped out the old generators, which were old and might have deserved to be ripped out, but they were kind of working, right? And they put in these new generators, right? And the new generators were all proprietary to American companies, and they worked on natural gas. Now, Iraq doesn't capture its natural gas. It ought to, but it doesn't. And if it were capturing its natural gas, it doesn't have a distribution system for its natural gas. So now they've got these huge kilowatt generators that are supposed to run on natural gas. So the Army Corps of Engineers steps in and says, well, we'll get them to work on oil. So they get them to work on oil. So then they start running them, and they can only run at about half capacity on oil. But the trouble is every 6 months they become clogged on oil. So now at least half of those are not functioning at all, right? And the others are functioning at a very low level. So what you actually have in Iraq, right, is an electrical system in which there is one province neglected by the U.S., which worked on its own behalf, that actually has 24 hours worth of electricity. There is no other province in Iraq, including the province of Baghdad, that has more than 14 hours of electricity a day. Now, aside from the fact that you can't imagine, what you're going to do, you can't run an economy with that, right? What's a factory going to do when the electricity goes off, right? So the economy is wrecked, okay? And all sorts of ways. We're talking 60% unemployment. One small piece of this that you really need to know about is that when the U.S. walked in, of course, they don't like the idea of state-run factories, right? State enterprises are an absolute no-no. So 3 months after the United States arrived in Baghdad, displaced Saddam Hussein, they shut down 192 factories. Just said, go home, folks. We're not running any of these public factories anymore. Okay, now those factories were 35% of the economy, but they were also what we call the core of the economy, right? So to give you an example, the tanning industry was run by the state. Now there's a very large leather industry that relied on the state for all of its leather. And then they were making handbags and shoes and leather jackets and all sorts of things that they were actually, it's an export industry in Iraq. Employed 200,000 workers before the U.S. got there, and now employs 20,000 workers. Getting rid of the tanning got rid of the rest of the industry. And we do this over and over again. One more example of this is the date industry. Okay, now, date trees take 15 years to reach maturity. So once you've got them, you've got to kind of, the goose that's laying the golden egg, right? Well, not necessarily. Because what happened in the date farm industry is, first of all, the places where the dates are also happen to be places where the insurgents were. So in the use of the military, what you go in there and you blow up their hiding places, which happen to be the date tree forests, if you will, right? So they were destroying them. But there was another military activity too, which is there was a state-run pesticide service in which these crop dusting planes would fly over the date trees and other crops and dust them against pests, right? Well, that's a state-run enterprise. You want pesticides? Hire a private supplier. But the other part is that the U.S. government, when they realized what they were doing, they said, well, you got to let us get up there. The date trees are going to die. And the U.S. military said, we've got control of the air. We're not going to let any of these planes up there. Some insurgent can get in a plane and drop a bomb on our soldiers. So we're not going to let you put those planes in the air. We're too vulnerable to that. So here you have it. Again, the military thing and the economic thing dovetail, right? Okay, so wipe it out. Well, the date farm industry is gone. The decline was from 33 million trees to 9 million trees, okay? About 75% of the international production is gone. The industry that processed dates for export, 150 processing factories before the U.S. arrived, now there are 6. They're importing dates, okay? Right, if they can afford it. Okay, on and on. I don't even want to get into healthcare, but what I do want to do is give you a sense, right, of where this brings us to. You end up with this devastation, right? And the devastation, by the way, is being reproduced, right? It's being reproduced in Afghanistan, and it's being reproduced in the tribal areas of Pakistan now, right? This devastation. To give you a sense, just from Iraq, okay, we don't know how many more than 1 million people have been killed in Iraq. And the best estimate I saw in the middle of 2007 was 1.2 million, right? Now, things calmed down starting in 2007, but it has to be more than that, right? This resulted in 500,000 female-headed households in an economy in which unemployment among women is 80%. 80% unemployment among women. Now, among men, it's somewhere between 30 and 60%, depending on where you go and how you count. right? Remember, in the worst areas of the United States, in the worst part of the Depression, 34% unemployment. So we aren't talking about any place in Iraq that resembles the U.S. under the Depression. It's higher, right? 4.5 million people have been displaced, and they are not going back to their homes because the homes are destroyed, they have been ethnic cleansed, right? The agricultural areas, there are whole agricultural areas that have been denuded of population, right? No more agriculture there. Not just the date farm disaster, but the drought disaster, the U.S. policy about agriculture in 5 or 6 other ways. So you have places in which 95% of the livestock have died. 60% of the arable land is not only not under cultivation, but is no longer arable, right? It's lost the ability to be cultivated because of what's, like in the Middle West in the United States in the 1930s, when the dust storms come up, they have sandstorms, okay? And they're much worse. The rivers have been drained not just because of the war, but also because of upstream damming. The irrigation system has been wrecked, largely because of the war, also because of dilapidation. The agricultural, this was the country, remember, the Fertile Crescent, the land between 2 rivers. Now it's the desert between 2 rivers. Give you a sense of this, there are 200,000 people living in abandoned government buildings with no facilities, no water, no electricity, right? 200,000 people, some of them upwards of 3 years now, right? And nowhere to go. And when the United States brings in, the United States claims to have spent $53 billion on reconstruction. And you can go from one sector to another and nothing has improved, right? Maybe the U.S. can make the claim, well, they didn't get worse because of our investment. But mostly what you find, right, is that the investment did not benefit the Iraqis in various ways because of, for example, these turbines and many other things. And perhaps the most potent, powerful, and important of these things is that when international companies are brought into Iraq to do work, they do not hire Iraqis. They just don't hire Iraqis. They don't want them. It doesn't sound a lot different from the way multinational companies operate everywhere, right? What do they say? But in Iraq, maybe it's a little bit different. They say, these guys want too much money, they're lazy, and besides that, they're insurgents and they'll blow us up, right? And, all 3 of these things are almost true. You know what I mean? And so that money is not being put into Iraq. So you have massive malnutrition. The education system is wrecked. A generation is not getting educated. Now, is there any hopeful signs here? Well, there are. I mean, I just want to say a couple of things about this. In the midst of all this, Iraqi workers have organized. And the most notable of this is that the oil workers in the south of Iraq, where all the oil is being extracted at the moment, are very well organized. So well organized that when the United States occupation government tried to deliver the control of the Basra port to American companies, to a Halliburton subsidiary, KBR, right? The oil workers went on strike and they said, no oil is coming out of this port where all the oil is coming out of. If you do this, we want a national company owned by the Iraqi government to be running this port. They had a 3-day strike, and KBR walked out and said, we're not dealing with this. And they were unable to do that. Right? That same group of workers who had been illegal under Saddam Hussein, who are still illegal under the U.S. occupation, and were still illegal under the new government, right, have raised their wages 800%. They have fought for working conditions. They've successfully done this. They've inspired. The electrical workers are organized. Insofar as electricity is produced there, it's produced by union workers, right? And by the way, the electrical union is headed by a woman. Very interesting, politically incredibly sophisticated. And all of these unions, there's unions in a great many places, textile, hotel, electrical. There's more all the time. There's real energy there, right? And these unions have been in the forefront of the struggle in Iraq over who's going to control that oil, which I didn't spend a lot of time in today, and I'll give you just one piece. This is from the Oil Workers Union, right? When the oil law that is currently under consideration, which would permit, by the way, that oil law has in it two clauses that are very relevant to what we're talking about. One of them is that it would allow the international oil companies to control oil production in Iraq, right? And the second part would be it would allow the international oil companies to employ non-Iraqis in the oil industry, right? Okay, which would be astonishing, right? So the Oil Workers Union said this about it: "We demand that all oil companies be prevented from entering into any long-term agreement concerning oil while Iraq remains occupied. We demand that the Iraqi government tear up the current draft of the oil law and begin to develop a legitimate oil policy based on full and genuine consultation with the Iraqi people. Only after all occupation forces are gone should a long-term plan for the development of our oil resources be adopted." Right? And they have led protests at every level, right, on this point. And there have been a number of contracts signed. They have not yet been implemented. There's a struggle at every site. In one site, there was a small contract signed with the Chinese National Oil Company. Now, those guys are the good guy capitalists these days, right? And there were guarantees put into the contract that it would be local subcontractors and local workers would be employed on the site. When the International Oil Company arrived, they brought South Asian workers with them, which is the traditional source of the workers that are used in Iraq, right? And first, there were protests from the local tribal leaders. There were strikes, and then it was sabotaged. And that work has stopped. Right? That's the first oil contract. So at every level, I mean, there is this kind of resistance, right? And, you know, there's a whole story with the oil contracts. You know, this is only one little tiny piece of it. But at every point, that effort to take the oil out of the hands of the Iraqi people and put it in the hands of the international oil companies has so far failed. I'm not saying it will. But if you just step back from that and think about it in terms of this broad effort, right, by the U.S. to have this very hands-on, embedded presence in this region, right, it's not surprising to see how energetic the United States is in trying to impose and insinuate its policies in this situation and in the other countries. And there is ongoing resistance of all sorts, not just Taliban-ish type of resistance, but civil society resistance. In the parliament of Iraq, there's resistance. In the local city of Basra, there's resistance. Right? It's at every level we see this resistance. And to a considerable degree in Iraq anyway, the working class itself is at the center of it. Thank you. The question about the U.S. policy being against our self-interest is a tricky policy, is a tricky question, because, I'd put it this way. For one thing is, there's a class analysis that's buried in the question, right? Which is, U.S. policy could be the interest, let's say, of the oil companies, who, by the way, were very hesitant about that war. They weren't so enthusiastic about it, right? But you could say, okay, we got a policy that's in the interest of the oil companies, but it's not in the interest of the American people, right? And I think that we can say that about U.S. policy pretty generally, okay? That what we see our foreign policy doing is answering, at least in its own opinion, to the interests of, for lack of a better term, the capitalist class. Okay. But I think the other part of your question is but this isn't working for them either, right? And I think that there is a way in which that's right, okay? That, you know, the wealth and the power of our country is being dissipated in these imperial efforts, right? And I think that this is, you know, to me, it holds out the hope that maybe they'll come to their senses, right? But I do think that we have to understand that they're working in a world in which there's an unpredictable future, right? And it's not exactly clear what they can accomplish, right? So I'll just offer this piece, right? There's this famous interchange that took place between a reporter and a high government official that is generally accepted to be Paul Wolfowitz, but it might be some other unnamed high government official, right? In which, just before the invasion of Iraq, this guy, the reporter says, "Why are you guys going to do this? Don't you know you're going to end up in a quagmire like in Vietnam? You can't succeed in transforming this country in the way you want to do it, right?" And the high Bush administration official said, "Look, you guys are locked into the real world, into reality. But we're the ones that make the reality you're locked into. We're going to go in here and we're going to remake reality, and then you're going to get locked into the new reality we have created," right? Now, that may sound like megalomania of the first order, put him in an insane asylum. But unfortunately, it's been done, right? Just often enough for these guys to convince themselves they can do it. And I would, to harness that kind of idea to the larger question, there's a great moment in the Bush administration, right? Right at the beginning, before 9/11, they set up the Cheney Energy Commission, which we all think, right, was kept secret because they didn't want us to know that they were in bed with the oil companies, right, the energy companies, right? But we all knew that they were in bed with the energy companies. That isn't why they kept it secret. What they actually were doing there was they were saying, how are we going to handle the coming energy crisis, right? Already 4 years old, 2 years old for them, because in 1998, U.S. finally was over 50% dependent on foreign energy, right? So they already knew that they were in trouble and it was getting worse, and they knew about peak oil already, and even worse than that, the crossing of the demand and the supply and the creation of these tremendous energy problems. And they basically had to decide, right, between two things. Either we've got to figure out how to ratchet up oil production and buy ourselves 10, 15 years of adequate supplies of oil, right? Or we're going to have to go right now into a very severe conservation, alternative energy, renewable energy sources regime, which is going to affect every important industry in America. They are going to have to tighten their belts, invest huge amounts of money against problematic profits. And just think about the real estate investment industry. I mean, all that glass. You've got to do something about it. Every factory has to do cogeneration, right? And that's not even, we haven't even gotten to the insulation parts, right, you know. Well, they decided we can do it. All we got to do is get the Middle East to double production. Now, of course, they don't want to do it. The Middle East doesn't want to do it because that's sucking the oil out at a much more rapid rate, lowering prices from what we would get. You know, the Middle East is looking and saying, $100 a barrel, that sounds pretty good to me. And what the Cheney Energy Commission wants them to do is keep the price of oil down at $20 a barrel. Okay. They said, but we can do it. A $40 billion war, take over Iraq, like the dominoes will fall. Okay, the reality-based people don't think we can do it, but we change reality. We're going to change the complexion of the whole place, right? Now, we can say they're crazy, but they were not crazy within the logic of what they thought they could accomplish, right? And by the way, what the Obama administration feels they can accomplish, because they're still doing it, right? Okay, wait. British colonialism. Don't say that British colonialism failed. The Brits will say it succeeded, right? A couple of 100 years is a pretty good run. You know, be careful. The colonialism that we are looking at here is different from theirs. It's much more intrusive and transformative, right? But there is a colonialism being promulgated, but maybe not successfully. What the real interesting contrast is between this and Germany and Japan after World War II. When the United States went into devastated countries and said, let's rebuild the existing economy. In these countries, the US wants to build a completely new economy. It's far more transformative. Sunni, Shia, Pashtun. I'll say a very brief thing about this. You know, in Iraq, the Sunnis and the Shia coexisted peacefully 1,000 years. For 1,000 years. The way to describe their relations is Catholics and Protestants in the United States is a good way to do it, right? Now, Catholics and Protestants have coexisted in a lot of places, and then you have an explosion in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants, and you got an explosion in Iraq between Sunni and Shia. No doubt about it, right? It was basically caused by the United States, sometimes intentionally and sometimes not intentionally. There's a long story attached to that, right? But imperial powers always discover racism. They just, inevitable. It's like independent discovery. They don't have to read the history books. They look around, they say, Jesus Christ, you know, these guys are fighting me. If I can get them to fight each other, I'm going to be in a much better place. And they do, you know. And the same thing is going on in Afghanistan between the Pashtuns and everybody else, right? And not that, I'm not trying to say that, you know, the United States is a puppet master in this, because it's more like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, you know. These things have been created by the situation, and not because there's these 1,000 years of hatred and just waiting to explode kind of thing, right? And what people there need to think about, and what people here need to think about, is the conditions under which those kinds of divisions cannot be used in this way, and instead people who are being challenged in the way that the U.S. occupations challenge them can harness their energy and anger in a way that will give them a productive outcome, expel the U.S., and get to work trying to build reasonable lives. The Ba'ath Party is not non-existent, but it doesn't exist in any shape that resembles an effort to restore a Saddamist regime, right? That's over, okay? If they're going to get a Saddamist regime in Iraq, it'll probably be Maliki with the backing of the U.S., you know, and you hear echoes of that, but you're not going to get a restoration of the Ba'athist regime that Saddam presided over. The Ba'athist Party has, you know, a lot of other tendencies in it, and people in those that were in those tendencies have been active in various settings, all sorts of different places, and but they are in no way a dominant force. And as a matter of fact, one of the, you know, big difficulties for the Iraqi people is that, especially in the Sunni areas, there's no coherent leadership, or let's say coherent tendencies that can band together and, you know, constitute a very strong group, right? There were some real tendencies towards that. Association of Muslim Scholars, which was a group of religious leaders who were also insurrectionists. Let's call them insurrectionists, not insurgency. They were connected to insurgency in all sorts of ways, and they sought to give leadership and to provide coordination among all these separate insurgencies. But that has kind of been really weakened in the recent period. The tendencies are all organized at local levels and not across national boundaries, which gets me to the election. A really important thing that happened in this election, and by the way, in the earlier election in the provinces, and even in the election before that, is that what has developed, see, the situation has been that since the U.S. is so effective in defanging and destroying the Iraqi government. They did destroy the Iraqi government. This plan, right, this strategic idea of look, we got to get rid of these kinds of societies, right? They're, you know, when they said, you know, we all heard about de-Baathification, right? They fired 2 million people all at once. They wiped out the government. They wiped out the government. So there was no administrative apparatus in Iraq at all. And then, when they installed this client government, right, the U.S. has been very, very careful to make sure that this client government has almost no ability to rule. They have no presence in the local areas, right? So when Maliki says, I've got a political party and I got 87 parliamentary members, right? What he really is saying is that I have made promises to local leaders, tribal leaders and religious leaders in local areas, right, that they should join me, and in exchange for that, I will deliver to their local areas some of these meager resources that I have in my government, right, basically money, because he can't deliver administration or anything else, right, and then they've supported him, right, and then there are other tendencies, like the Sadras, who are really an important tendency, that's a Shia tendency, that have local groups. And they're a little more coordinated than other local groups, the Sadras, but it's still local groups. It's all local. So the real action in Iraq is at the local level. That's where you see leadership, where you see configurations of political tendencies and arguments and policies being developed. Okay, so for example, and this is an expression, again, this is where I see the working class, you know, somebody said, well, what is the working class up to, right? In Basra, where you have a very strong working class, you have a lot of civil society groups, you have a number of religious groupings, right? And you have a local government that is, at least occasionally, quite coherent. And then other times, you know, it became so coherent that Maliki invaded Basra. And then he was being defeated, so the U.S. came in and helped him, you know, conquer it, right? But that conquest wasn't followed up with an administrative apparatus responsive to Baghdad. The Baghdad government, the biggest operating electrical power plant in Iraq is in Basra. So what they're saying is, it's our electricity. We're taking it, right? And then, you know, Maliki's saying, no, that's a national resource, right? So they're having a fight over this, and they've actually kind of negotiated a deal where they're going to get a disproportionate share. So they're better off than most other places, right? Well, up in Kirkuk, they're getting all their electricity right now. In Basra, they're taxing the oil that comes through Basra, and they're financing their own local government, right? And that local government is at least partially bound to actually deliver various kinds of services to the people in Basra. So you have this situation in which these things are happening at the local level. In Fallujah, you know, the famous Fallujah, right, the insurgency has never ended there. They're still fighting there, and they're fighting over all sorts of things. They demanded that they be given a, you know, the city was wrecked, they needed a sewage system. So the U.S. said, okay, we'll give you $100 million for a sewage system. And that was 5 years ago. Well, they just said they opened, and it turns out to be 1/3 the size that is needed there. But they did get that out of it, right? They did get that, right? Well, we don't know. I mean, it could fall apart the way a lot of the other American constructions have. Okay, so why no international alliances between the working class of Iraq and other countries? There is a kind of interesting one between Iraq and the United States. There's a group in the United States called U.S. Labor Against the War, and they have fraternal relations with the Iraqi Union movement. They've brought Iraqi Union leaders here twice for very important and, you know, useful speaking tours, right? And there was a very important union meeting held in I can't remember the capital of Kurdistan, right? In which U.S. labor, British labor representatives, a couple other European countries came to a national meeting of the labor movement in Iraq and talked about attempting to coordinate. But, we know from the fact that we don't hear about it that nothing great has come out of this, but something has come out of this. They're still fighting for the law to be changed so that they're legal. They're still illegal, right? Bremer came in, he wiped out all the Saddamist legislation except one, and that was the law that made the unions illegal. Supremely uncomfortable with the leadership that American politicians have provided on this, most notably our current president, But, I guess we could say we've got Kucinich, right? He's nationally visible, and he has been pretty consistently against the war. And you do see these tendencies every once in a while for, a fairly substantial minority in the House or the Senate, usually the House, to try to get something, to try to block something or get something. And, and I do believe they're sincere, and I think they kind of follow the logic that we were talking about a few minutes ago, which is that even if you look at this from the point of view of the American elite or the capitalist class of the United States, these wars are, destroying our economy, they're destroying our standing in the world, they're undermining American hegemony, right? Let's stop them and try another strategy. And I think there's, a substantial number of politicians that to some degree or another have that on their mind. But I also think that, American history is pretty clear on this, is that waiting for politicians to take the initiative never has worked. It just never has worked. They take the initiative when they're responding to the fear that something really dire is going to happen or the American people won't put up with it at all. Let me step back a little further. You've got this country that aspires to be the economic hegemon, the U.S., right? But, from an economic point of view, we ain't the hegemon anymore. Our economy is pretty shaky, even in the times of great prosperity. And what has emerged, starting right after the Vietnam War, really, is that there are centers of capitalist development, very powerful, energetic, that can outcompete us in all sorts of ways, and just left to their own devices are going to cause American capitalism a lot of trouble. But what happened in the 1990s is that it became very clear that there was politically the United States was already in decline. One nice little symptom of that is that earlier in the 20th century, the United States could always get the UN to do what it wanted. It's a nice sign of political domination. And then late in the century, the UN kept having votes and things that the United States didn't like, and it got to the point where the United States stopped giving money to the UN in order to protest the fact that the UN was taking positions that the U.S. didn't like. A real sign of this kind of decline of the hegemony, right? This is all without that, right? So politically in decline, economically in decline, but not militarily. As soon as the Soviet Union drops, there's one superpower left. We spend just about as much on military as the rest of the world combined, right? And we can beat anybody, right? And what has evolved is that there's a set of economic interests, and the idea is we will use the military to get there, right? Economic, political interests, let's use the military. And so it's become more and more and more militarized, so that now our second largest export industry is even military equipment, right? So we're becoming a militarized society. And you see the effort, and you see it failing, and and then each failure generates a ratcheting up of the problem, right? And I've been waiting to see those in the, let's call them the economic elite for a moment, right? Industries like the auto industry, right? Or the construction industry saying, wait a minute here, there's got to be a better way. I'm going to get shafted by this, right? And so then you're looking for what historically we used to call splits in the ruling class. You're looking for, I'm still waiting, I read very carefully, I like the Wall Street Journal. It's not as good as it used to be, ever since what's-his-name got his hands on it. They stopped doing investigative reporting. But I keep looking for this kind of, that every so often we do see, these real divisions in which, dissonant voices occur, right? There was a moment during the war when Scowcraft was being very critical of the war, and you said, okay, so maybe this is the start of that division and we're going to see it. And so you could convince yourself that maybe, even with all this mincing of words during the campaign, that Obama was in some way expressive of a division. But then when Obama took office, seamless. It was seamless. The foreign policy is seamless, right? The one thing that people point to is, look at, he's being conciliatory towards Iran. But that's rhetorical only, right? When the Turks and the Brazilians come up with this plan, right, he dismisses it out of hand, at great expense to do that, by the way, because the Turks are completely pissed about that, right? And the Turks are not trivial. They're really important, right? So there's no sign of it yet, right? It's like they won't, they're going to march us right into the sea, We're waist deep in the big muddy, and the big fool just keeps going on. 4 or 5 years ago, I would have resonated with that a lot more than I do now, because 4 or 5 years ago, that was so on my mind, exactly the logic you're expressing. Young Guard, the Young Turks, right? Silicon Valley, Gates, Gates becoming much more politically active and forceful, joining Soros. Soros has kind of receded himself rather than, accelerated his efforts, right? 4 years ago, I was really looking for that to happen. Now, I got to admit, just on an emotional basis, I've kind of given up on it, you know what I mean? Just because it hasn't happened. But I still believe the argument you're making, which is these things do happen.
Dinosaurs, the way
they do happen, they did happen in the late 20s, early 30s, right, where you actually got the development of what, nowadays we call enlightened capitalists, right? I have to reiterate what I think history teaches us, is that those people do seem to arise only when the ordinary folks make the whole system tremble. That seems to be historically when those people do arise. So I guess we got to make the whole system tremble in order to get out,